Okay, welcome back to our second class talking about gender and sex, gender roles, and the like. If you remember at the end of our last class, we were talking about the fact that although many people out there in the general population may assume that gender is something that is somehow genetically encoded in our biology, that naturally boys are one way and girls are a different way, good social scientific evidence suggests very differently, and that is that gender is something that is socially constructed. We know that because of Margaret Mead's research. This is the anthropologist who went to the South Pacific and found that there were big differences in gender roles among some of the tribal peoples there that were very different than gender roles that we in America had come to assume are natural. We also know that because within any culture, even American culture, gender differences and gender roles have changed over time. So just like it was unusual in the 1930s to find female airline pilots or male flight attendants, it's very common to see those today. So we know that gender is very much a socially constructed thing. It's not a biological thing. So if anybody were to ever ask you, what is it that determines gender differences? What is it that makes gender? You would be smart to say it's much more of a social thing than a biological thing. It's much more something that comes with our culture, our upbringings, our surroundings. It's an invented thing as opposed to something that is something biological. But the question arises, why in the world do we have these gender roles in the first place? Why do we have gender roles? Let me share my screen here. This is a document that shows kind of in a skeletal form some of the notes that you should be taking for today. And I haven't spelled out every single detail any more than I do in class because you really do learn by writing your own notes. But these are some of the major highlights. See, these are the headings that you should have in your notes as you take them today. So the question is, why do we have gender roles? Well, like many questions in sociology, it really depends on who you ask. So if you ask a structural functionalist, that's someone who believes that society is really comprised of groups of people who work together to provide unity and stability. Those sociologists are going to likely say that gender roles provide a quote unquote natural division of labor based on a person's sex. So if you have some civilization that you want to continue and you're trying to figure out how in the world you can get different groups of people to do different things to contribute to the growth and stability of your civilization, well, you might decide to divide up that group and have males do one things and females do another set of things. And you know that females face some physical limitations when they're pregnant. They're not as mobile or perhaps able to work quite as hard as they are if they're not pregnant. And unlike men, women are naturally very well equipped to nourish infants. So a functionalist might assume that it's just practical for women to take primary responsibility for child raising, child rearing. And while they're at home, it's also practical for them to maintain the household by cooking, cleaning, etc. A functionalist might also look conversely at men and realize, well, that unlike women, men are not impaired during gestation, during pregnancy, and they're actually pretty helpless to provide for a baby's survival needs. Yes, men have breasts, but they're not good for very much. And so men are better suited to work outside of the home, hunting, fishing, protecting the family, gathering food, etc. Well, there's strengths and weaknesses to that approach. One of the strengths is that it does do a pretty good job of explaining gender stratification in a lot of traditional cultures, like hunter-gatherer societies, where the men are going out hunting and gathering and the women are staying staying behind, um, providing for their families. There's pretty good evidence that's emerging, by the way, in some of these traditional societies that women worked right alongside men, um, capturing game, downing large animals with bows and arrows. We have an anthropologist in our department who's studying that. But the traditional story has gone. Women take care of the home because that's what they're naturally suited to do. Men take care of things outside of the home because, again, that plays to their strengths. So one of the strengths of that theory in terms of explaining gender roles and gender differences is that it does explain gender stratification in some of these traditional societies. One of the weaknesses of the functionalist approach to understanding gender divisions is that they may do a pretty good job of explaining hunter-gatherer societies, but they don't do a really good job of explaining why these differences in people's expectations, what men should do, what women should do, why those differences persist even in modern societies. After all, in modern societies, we have birth control. Birth control allows couples to have sex without fear of getting pregnant. So pregnancy doesn't have to enter the picture. We also have infant formula so that men can feed their babies just as easily as women can. And we also have all kinds of labor-saving devices like buses and cars. So you can get to the grocery store. Men and women can buy food for the family. Men and women can watch YouTube videos and learn to cook for families. Women can be responsible for acquiring food just like men can. And so it doesn't quite explain the gender roles that persist in modern societies. There are plenty of ways, plenty of families that really insist on having those traditional gender roles when you could argue they're really pretty much outmoded by modern conveniences and modern inventions. So other sociologists say that gender roles, thinking about conflict theorists here, gender roles are just another way that the dominant group uses its power to keep the subordinate group subordinate. So it's just another way for men to keep women in subordinate positions. And if you're a conflict theorist, you may look at how our societies got along before capitalism. Before capitalism really got underway, men and women typically worked side by side to contribute equally to the family survival. They both worked within the household to collect or raise food, to care for the children, etc. With capitalism, that began to change. Men began to work in factories, which defined them as producers of goods and services. Women were typically transformed into consumers, and they were considered to be secondary. Both parties were exploited, men at work, women at home. And if you know something about these early factories, it's also true that there are plenty of women who worked, for example, in textile mills. But the thinking, according to conflict theorists, generally speaking, is that the fact that men produced commodities that had value in the workplace and women didn't meant that men were valued with a higher status than women. That's the conventional thinking beside the whole question of how women and men have different gender roles and therefore a different amount of value in our society. So there are some strengths with that approach. One of them is that it does a really good job of explaining gender inequality. We'll be talking about gender inequality and sexism more next week than this week. But just keep in mind that one of the strengths of this theory is that it does do a really good job of explaining why men have more power and more influence than women. The second point is that if you look at the things that we value and the things that we don't value in our society, it is true that our culture does tend to value things associated with males, and we also tend to devalue things that we associate with females. And a feminist author by the name of Gloria Steinem says that men use the fact that menstruation is confined to females, only females menstruate. But that men use that association between women and having periods to denigrate women. For example, think of the number of demeaning ways that women are referred to by men for having menstrual periods. I mean, I can't think of one complimentary adjective that people use to describe women who are having periods. And they tend to also kind of push together menstruation with weakness. Um, because women may have a difficult time working or socializing when they're having their periods, uh, we tend to say, or men particularly, may tend to say that women are weak. And Gloria Steinem makes the point, and you're going to read this in a reading for next week, that it can be really hard to see bias against women when you're socialized to accept it. So we're surrounded by it, we take it for granted, we don't really notice it. It's easier to see it if you reverse reality, if you deliberately associate males with something feminine as opposed to females. All of a sudden, you can see, wait a minute, that's kind of a demeaning way that we refer to people who have these circumstances. So she writes this piece. It's a kind of a tongue-in-cheek article called "If Men Could Menstruate," and she imagines what it would be like if men had periods. And her conclusion is, if men were the people who had periods, they would consider menstruation not something to be reviled or avoided or spoken badly about, but men would consider menstruation to be absolutely sacred. They wouldn't denigrate it. Men would actually prize it as opposed to scorning it. So instead of using menstruation to denigrate a person who's menstruating, they would use it to praise them. And they would even kind of push together menstruation with strength. Men would brag about how much blood they had lost on their period. So you imagine walking down the feminine hygiene aisle at Kroger and overhearing two men talking about what pads they buy. And you can imagine one of the men asking the other, "Well, what size do you wear?" And the other one saying, "Oh, I usually wear mediums." And the other guy saying, I mean, just like men kind of try to get the best of each other to try to brag about how they're powerful and strong. The other guy saying, "Oh, mediums? Oh, I used those when I was a teenager. Yeah, I'm up to supers now. Sometimes even two supers don't hold my flow." Strutting around the male hygiene aisle, because all of a sudden, if you associate menstruation with males, they would feel very differently about it. So one of the weaknesses of conflict theory is it doesn't really account for households in which people share chores, they share responsibilities, they share duties, much more like pre-industrial societies used to do, where people shared their income producing responsibility and shared childcare, that kind of thing. And there are households that do that. These are non-traditional households. You might even see a woman be the principal earner. And so conflict theory does not do a very good job of explaining why those households persist and in many cases even thrive. The dominant theoretical model for explaining how gender differences proliferate and how they spread intergenerationally from one generation to another really is symbolic interaction theory. The idea that through interpersonal interaction, we learn what being a male or female means, and then we spread that, we propagate it throughout society in families that we raise. We propagate this idea intergenerationally. And that's how people get a gender identity. And as it turns out, according to this theory, the dominant socializing force for doing that is the family. So I want to explain how this happens. I just want to pick out from the literature some examples of how we learn gender and how we teach gender through interpersonal interaction through the family. And it starts at birth. So we see gender differences in how babies are described, how they're demarcated, and how they're dressed, how parents describe them, how parents demarcate them, mark them off from other babies. In other words, how they name them. I was trying to think of a D word that's synonymous with naming, and demarcating is the closest I could get. And then finally how they're dressed. So listen to this explanation here, and I'm going to start with descriptions. So when parents are asked to describe their newborns, sociologists know that they use different adjectives. And as it turns out, the adjectives have gendered implications. They're not just value free, they're loaded with gendered expectations. So parents use different words to describe their newborns depending on the baby's sex. For example, for boys, parents tend to say the boys are strong or solid or independent. For girls, parents tend to say that girls are cute, sweet, or delicate. Boys are strong and solid, girls are cute and sweet. And these descriptors may sound innocent, but they're labels. And labels, as Ernest Kaufman tells us, are powerful. And in fact, we think that they can form the basis of all types of behaviors. So think for a second about how labeling your child with a certain adjective might actually influence how you interact with the child, how people interact with the child. And if you label a boy as strong or independent, maybe you'll begin to act that way toward him differently than you might interact toward a girl. Maybe you're going to roughhouse with the boy. Maybe you're going to toss him up in the air and catch him. And maybe you're going to play sports with the boy, sometimes at a ridiculously early age. How many of you have seen pictures or heard stories about fathers who will go to the maternity ward in a hospital first time they've met the baby, and what are they holding? A baseball bat or a catcher's mitt, indicating their enthusiasm to play with the baby boy. Well, do we have that same enthusiasm to play with baby girls? Typically not. Why? Because we know that babies, know in quotation marks, babies are too delicate, too soft, too fragile to do that. And so we tend to be overly protective of girls. If there's a hint of rain in the forecast, it's the girls who might be told to wear a hat and a sweater, perhaps not so much the boys. If there's a chance for our kids to go out for Little League, we typically shuttle boys into that behavior than girls. I mean, that's changing, but traditionally, it's a boy thing to do sports. And so if you describe a boy and a girl differently, we tend to behave differently, and maybe they develop different levels of confidence with their body, different levels of athletic coordination, different levels of eye-hand coordination, etc. When I see women who seem uncomfortable as adults in their bodies, it makes me wonder how people may have interacted with them as kids. Let's talk about different ways that we name babies. So, every era has fashionable names. In the 1930s and 40s, it was nothing to find boy babies named Albert or George or Sam, and girl babies named Betty or Judy or Phyllis. Today, those names aren't quite in favor. Others are more fashionable. Sometimes names drop out of favor really quickly. If you look at page 202, this is a listing of how popular certain names are over time. This is, the Department of Commerce keeps a listing of, this is the place that assigns Social Security numbers to babies. It also keeps track of the names that parents give babies over time. And the Department of Commerce has figured out that if you track the number of parents who are naming their kids Donald, it drops pretty precipitously on page 202. And sociologists look at that and they think, well, that's about the time that Donald Duck came into existence from the Disney Corporation, this really disagreeable, cranky cartoon character. Suddenly, that character appears on the big screen, and parents don't want to name their kid Donald anymore. It's unclear to me whether we'll see that kind of a drop now with the former president having such a high profile, partly because he has many fans. I'm not quite sure if the people who are rushing to name their Donald might outweigh or at least match the number of parents who would never name their kids Donald because of his example. Conversely, if you look at page 203, you see the rising popularity of the name Olivia. And Olivia happens to be the name of our daughter, who was born in 1998. And we happened to name her because of the Cosby Show. So back when the Cosby Show was really popular, it ran in the mid 80s to the early 90s. There was a character on that show who was a little girl who was bright and talented, and she was so smart. We thought to ourselves, my wife and I, boy, if we could have a daughter half as smart as that one, we would have it made. And so you can see some of the influences that may make some names popular, other names not popular. But the point is that names are really something to take seriously. So, for example, last week, we learned that your chances of getting a job interview might hinge on the name that's at the top of a resume. And researchers also tell us that kids who have popular names tend to be better liked and tend to be considered more intelligent than kids whose names are unpopular or difficult to pronounce. So if you want to look at names critically, you will understand that names tend to be gendered. There are gender differences in how parents name their children. Let me explain to you the tendency here. The tendency is for parents to choose different kinds of names for their sons and their daughters. For sons, we tend to name sons with durable names, names that stand the test of time, names that are permanent, names that are solid. For example, we tend to name boys after biblical characters. And of course, the Bible is one of the most permanent books in the Western canon. If you turn to page 204, whoops, sorry. If you turn to page, 204, you will see a table that lists the top names, again from the Department of Commerce for the year 2010. And look at the boys' names and look at the number that are names of biblical characters that you find in the Bible. Jacob, Michael, Noah, Daniel. Now look at the girls' names and the numbers that are in the Bible. I don't see any of those that are in the Bible. So we tend to name boys along that trend. We also tend to name boys family names, names of fathers, grandfathers. And the thinking is that that connects a boy to a family legacy. Now, I've said before that families, at least Western families, tend to be patriarchal, that families tend to give boys much more power and influence than girls. And you can see here, when you link a boy by their name to the family legacy, that's kind of continuing that power, connecting them to previous generations in ways that girls rarely enjoy an advantage from having. And then finally, think about the fact that we tend to name boys names that are permanent and that transcend periods. In other words, boys tend to get names that a lot of boys get over time, over and over again. They transcend historical periods. If you look at page 205, for example, you will see the top names of the last 100 years. And you'll see them ranked by how frequently parents give them those names. And it's not difficult to see the differences between the boys' names and the girls' names. Boys get named the same names many more times than girls do. So James, for example, is popular every year. Same with John, same with Robert. Those names have over 4 million kids born. If you look at the corresponding top three names for Mary, the top one is 3 million. Patricia is 1.5, Elizabeth 1.4. So those are names that are given much less frequently. So we tend to name, this is part of the argument that we tend to name boys names that are durable, that are permanent, solid, that tend to happen year after year. On the other hand, we tend to give girls non-durable names, names that are impermanent, names that are fleeting, names that are here one moment, gone the next. Here's some examples. Think about names of seasons: autumn, summer, two girls' names. Think about names of plants: heather, holly, especially flowers: iris, daisy, violet. It's all girl names. Think about names that are decorative: crystal, Tiffany, Tiffany lamps. And think about names that are trendy, that reflect a certain period. Olivia is a good example that reflected a certain period. There's an article that just came out in February. Let me see if I can share my screen and show you. Here, the website here is Huffington Post, and the title, Old Lady Baby Names Are on the Rise. Here are 38 to inspire you. Say hello to a new generation of Adas and Pearls. I don't know if you've noticed this, but baby names that used to be in fashion 100 years ago are back. Ada, Adelaide, Agatha, Beatrice, Betty, Celia, Cordelia. I didn't even know some of these were names. And in fairness, there are some old man names too. But the article goes on and on about how it's increasingly popular for girls to be named names that were popular a century ago. Now, why is that important? Well, it fits right into our discussion, doesn't it? About how girls tend to get named names that are trendy, that reflect a certain period of time. These are names that fall in and out of popularity, as opposed to boys who tend to get named the same names all the time. So the argument here is that girls get named names that are expendable. The situation suggests that girls are expendable and that boys are essential. They're really permanent. Girls are not fundamental to our society, but boys are. Now, and if you know anything about biology, and I know that even if you're not a bio major, you know this, do we need males to survive as a species? No, not really. I mean, we need a little bit of sperm, a few sperm cells, and that's about it. If somebody were to figure out how to save sperm in a big freezer, you could continue this, we could continue this species if something catastrophic happened to the earth, not so much if all females were wiped out. So the way that we name girls and boys really is an inversion of how important females are to the continuation and survival of the species. But we do it anyway. So let's talk about how we dress babies. Um, and the argument here is just as girls' names tend to stress things that are impermanent and non-essential, the same is true for girls' fashions. So there are several trends that a discerning eye will pick up if you look at traditional girls' fashions. Let me start with the first time I met our daughter, which is really interesting, our birth story. So my spouse was having what we thought was an uneventful pregnancy when she went in late in her pregnancy for a wellness visit. That's when they listen to your heartbeat, listen to the baby's heartbeat, take your blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera. And after the nurse had done this, she didn't say anything. In fact, she turned off the lights in the examination room and she left without saying a word. And we thought this was kind of unusual. A doctor came in a few minutes later, kept the lights off, and asked my wife how she was feeling. And she said, "I'm feeling okay." And he said, "Well, the reason we ask is that your blood pressure is really high." And he said, "I'm afraid we're going to uh, have this baby." It turns out my wife had a condition, a medical condition called preeclampsia, runaway blood pressure. Her blood pressure, which normally is about maybe 140 over 75, 130 over 170, was 210 over 110, which is huge. And you can run a risk of having a stroke with blood pressure that high. So they rushed her in for an emergency C-section. It was very dramatic. And my wife was fine. The baby was fine. So once the baby was delivered, Olivia was washed. And then they brought her out to see us, and she was wearing a little shirt. Let me show you the shirt. This is the shirt our daughter was wearing. Now, just trying to get it in focus here. I'm not really sure if you can see how small this is, but it's tiny. I didn't realize they made clothes this small. It's a tiny shirt. What struck me at the time, and I was in it in my doctoral program in sociology. What struck me actually as a sociologist was not the size, but the color, this pink color. As it turns out, this is a theme that we see in girls' fashions all the time. All right, well, I've de-blurred my background so you can see these clothes without it coming in and out of focus. So one of the trends is that girl clothing tends to be pink, which you might expect. Another is girl clothing tends to be marked with a lot of flowers. Again, the flowers, these impermanent flowers. And then finally, they tend to have lots of hearts. After all, love, romance can be fleeting. Affairs of the heart are considered to be less important than the realm of the mind. Um, but let me give you some examples of how those played out in clothing that we got for our daughter. Here's a little jacket. Looks like it's probably appropriate for maybe a 2-year-old. And it's very soft, first of all. Remember that basic um, gender characteristic of softness for girls. And if you look very carefully at the fabric, you can see these little roses that have been embedded in the fabric. So you got two characteristics of girls' clothing there, both the color as well as the flowers. Here's some pink pants. I'd never seen pink pants before we had a daughter, but they are a thing. Here's some pinkish pants, kind of lavender. How can you tell they're for girls? Well, you look down here at the cuffs, and they got flowers and hearts. Color, flowers, hearts. It's a trifecta of femininity. Here's a pair of jeans for maybe a 3-year-old or so. And at first thought, you might think, oh, wait a minute, this is blue. This must be for boys. Well, no, not so fast, mister, because you can look down at the cups here and see those flowers at the bottom. Those are clearly girls' pants. And the same here. If you saw a child walking with this jacket from behind, you might think, oh, who's that little boy? But if you look carefully, the fabric is embedded with tiny flowers. I'm not quite sure if you can even see it on the screen, but trust me, little clovers right in there, right? So make no mistake, don't be fooled. So what do boys' clothing styles look like? Well, there are changes in the fashion industry. The industry is really reflecting the fact that parents are changing their preferences because they're less likely to stick with the tradition. But let me show you some traditional boys' fashions. And again, the thing that strikes me here is how early in a boy's life or in the life of parents, these gender roles come into play. So, for example, here are some clothing called onesies. You just kind of put these on an infant, and they're good to go. But notice, in addition to the color, notice how they've chosen to illustrate the action that goes along with the clothing. For example, here's a little car, a little police car, with the caption. Not quite sure if you're reading this the way I'm seeing it on the screen. It's backwards on the screen, but it says a little hero. And what does that remind you of? If you're thinking, it might remind you of the Disney video where male characters are running to the rescue of female characters. And again, notice this is they could have used any two-wheel vehicle, or they could have used any symbol, really, but they chose a car, which shows motion, it shows activity, which is very much consistent with traditional gender roles. Another car, 3 cars, and talk about activity. These cars are on the move, just like you might expect the person wearing this to be. Here's a whole onesie with nothing but cars, taxis, trucks, you name it. They're all on there. I think this is interesting. We have a little applique here that says B is for bus. Now, they could have chosen any B word. B is for balloon. B is for who knows? Botswana. But they chose an active word that again fits the traditional gender stereotyping that we associate with males. Here's another one. This is clearly for an older boy. Um, and it's a good example of the same phenomenon that we've just seen, but you add 10 years to it. So by the time kids are 10, they are wearing shirts like this with fancy sports cars on them. Same idea. Maleness, activity, etc. Speed, danger, you name it. This is actually a not so subtle example of the kind of expectations that we have for male kids. It's a little uniform, little baseball uniform, comes with a shirt as well as these little baseball pants. And how do we know it's for baseball? Well, he's a slugger, indicating his athletic ability, his activity, good at sports. These are all traditional gender roles for boys. And you can see even down to the buttons, which are little baseballs, the expectation that the person who wears this is going to be athletically inclined. So I said that the dominant socializing force in teaching us gender roles is the family. And there are 3 ways that the family does this as kids grow up, according to sociologists. So one of them is And I'll get my notes back on the screen here. Sociologists tell us that there are lots of ways in which preschool children learn gender roles. One of them is how they play as children grow up, how they're rewarded, how they're dressed, and how they interact with parents. So I want to explain to you how you can see gender playing a role in all four of these activities. First of all, how play tends to be gendered. Now, this should not be a mystery to anyone who, if you're a boy, was given trucks or trains or guns for Christmas gifts, for birthdays, and or who was allowed to do riskier things, to play riskier games, to skateboard, to rock climb, to canoe across a lake. We typically do this with boys in large groups, teams, for example, which emphasizes competition and accomplishing goals. This is different from how we encourage girls to play. So instead of trucks and trains, we give girls dolls and stuffed animals. They are steered into safer leisure activities. Think about, if you're a girl, think about the things that you were encouraged to do, how you were encouraged to play as a girl. Chances are you're thinking maybe sewing, maybe crafts, maybe cooking. Um, I know that millions of American girls got those easy bake ovens when they were kids and probably thought, boy, this is really pretty cool. You probably didn't realize it had anything to do with gender expectations. But we steer people into activities that we expect them to embrace. And we don't expect girls to embrace rock climbing. We expect them to, or even activities in large groups, we expect them to involve themselves in safer leisure activities, and also in smaller groups, in what we call dyads, groups of two, or slightly larger groups, but not large enough to have team sports. And so as the boys are learning to compete, girls are learning how to communicate and collaborate and work with each other. Small wonder that when you get into the workplace, we do see women who are part of groups influence them in collaborative ways, and that's a difficult thing for boys, for men, because I think the boys are encouraged to compete and to win in competition with other boys from a very early age. So our play is gendered. Boys and girls are given different toys. They're allowed different degrees of risk when they use those toys or when they play. And they're also encouraged to form different size groups, which I would think has some impact on their future behavior. We also reward kids differently. We reward boys for physical prowess, for how big and strong they are, how fast they can run. We reward girls for their social skills, their linguistic skills. We've already talked about how dress is gendered in terms of color and designs. But if you think about the kinds of clothes that boys are allowed to wear, they can wear pants. And pants do not restrict your activity the way a dress does. You can play on the floor, you can stand on your head. If you're wearing a dress, not only is the fabric, much more fragile and easy to tear compared to blue jeans, but dresses are restrictive. They restrict the things that you can do. You can't climb a fence wearing a dress. You can't climb a tree wearing a dress. And you certainly can't open your legs wearing a dress. So the thinking there is that how we dress girls and boys differently, gives rise to different activities that we steer them into. And finally, how kids interact with parents is different. So parents encourage their boys, they question their boys, they teach their boys. Studies have shown that boys enjoy a more robust intellectual development because of how parents interact with them, as opposed to girls who tend, at least if they're traditional parents, they tend to pacify girls, they tend to quiet them. They sometimes they tend to put them down. They tend to talk down to them because they just don't respect their intellectual ability. Let me give you an example of this. This is a public service announcement uh, from the Ad Council that really does argue for treating even little girls with more respect than many parents do, particularly dads. But this is an ad that shows that. Let me share my screen here a little differently. And what you're going to see here is a scene of a dad and a little girl. They're on a beach, and the girl asks a very innocent question, which is, why is the sky blue? And when she asks the question, the dad gives a response that compliments how she looks, compliments her physical feature. And the girl responds with an answer that really surprises him. Watch this.
Sky blue? Well, to match your pretty eyes. Nope, not even close. See, all colors have wavelengths that are diffused by oxygen and nitrogen. Since blue is the shortest wavelength, it's diffused up to 10 times more. Who taught you that? Mommy.
By age 12, too many girls lose interest in math and science and their chance at future jobs. Keep her interest alive.
You know why mathematics is the basis of life as we know it? You tell me.
It's her future. Do the math.
So it's a great commercial by the Ad Council and Girl Scouts to really encourage people to think differently about girls' intellectual capacity, which is something that not all parents do. Okay, and finally, let's talk about what happens when these little boys and little girls reach adulthood. As it turns out, sociologists will tell us that there are differences in women's jobs and men's jobs in the home, suggesting that the roles that men and women play in the family are also gendered, have gendered patterns associated with them. For example, research shows that women perform specific types of jobs. The jobs have a theme. They are typically jobs that are required to be done several times a day. They are jobs that are time consuming. They're jobs that are time sensitive. And they are jobs that are simultaneous. Women tend to do jobs that are required several times a day, like washing dishes. They're time consuming, like running errands. They're time sensitive. The clock is ticking on them, like planning and preparing meals. And they're also jobs that are simultaneous. In other words, they require some degree of multitasking, maybe fixing dinner while helping the kids with their homework. Men's jobs are very different. So studies show that men do jobs that are seasonal, so not constant, but they are demanded in certain seasons of the year, and they are creative. So they're seasonal, think cutting the grass, raking the lawn, etc. Creating, maybe building something or fixing the toaster. You know, some jobs that require some inventiveness, some creativity, some ingeniousness. They get to use their brains in much different ways than women's jobs. So Are sociologists suggesting that we don't have free will? No, we're not suggesting that. But we are suggesting that whether we're aware of it or not, we tend to fall into, at least in traditional families, ways of thinking that are very gendered, that tend to treat girls very differently than boys, and that this pattern begins at birth, it's maintained during childhood, and it persists into adulthood, where the cycle continues when we have kids and then we socialize them the same way. One question that some students have when it comes to gender is they're trying to figure out how many gender differences might actually be biological. Aren't there real differences in how strong men and women are, how fast they are? And it's true, there are biological differences between males and females. And they don't seem to be socially constructed at all. And if you look at a male body and a female body, you can tell, well, there are clear differences here. The thing is, we tend to assume that those differences are much more meaningful than they are. So, for example, when we look at a male body, males typically are taller than females, and we think that they are stronger than females too, because of the muscular nature of male bodies. But the truth is, it's not that males are technically more muscular than females. Their muscles are simply in a different place. Men tend to have muscles above the waist. Women tend to have muscles at the waist or below the waist. And if you don't believe me, go to a YouTube and look at a video of a woman giving birth, and you'll realize you have to have a terrifically muscular pelvic area to push a baby out of you. Studies show that women's muscles are different than men's muscles as well. They're built for different types of tasks wherever they are in the body. Male muscles are typically built for strength, but for short-term strength, for bursts of power. Women's muscle fibers are better for endurance for the long term. So yes, we have differences between males and females. Does it mean that men are naturally superior than females? Well, probably not. Men are probably superior at certain things, but females are also superior at other things. Doesn't necessarily mean that gender and sex necessarily go together. There are biological differences between male bodies and female bodies, but the idea that men have all kinds of advantages, or that they're better in some way, some qualitative way than females, that really is a product of our culture and our Western thinking. So we'll talk more about how these cultural differences end up to give men more power, and talk about how sexism works and some of the consequences of sexism on Tuesday. Until then, have a good weekend.